By his own statements to the press in 1900 in Colorado Springs, he said he was in contact with intelligences from off the planet Earth, very coolly received by his scientific colleagues. He made the same announcement to the press in 1923 at the time of the Mars approach, the close approach in 23, and he made another announcement after that. And according to two people I know personally who worked with Tesla in the period in the late 30s and the early 40s, he had a great deal of RF equipment in his New York labs. He had two of them, actually. His residence at the Hotel New Yorker and a receiving station there. And he also had lab offices and a lab operation in the top towers and the top floor of the Waldorf Astoria, and those transmitters were located there. At least one of these two people said he was in contact with somebody off-planet nearly every day. He says, I didn't understand the equipment. He says, I know he was. The inference here, and the data I have, is that he was in contact with the outside, and he was getting information which says, you've got a very serious problem. You've got to solve it or you're going to lose people. They'll be dead. And so he went, based on this, to the Navy. The Navy would not give him additional time. He says, I know how to solve the problem, but he says, I need more time to design new equipment. The Navy says, there's a war on. You can just make it work. Don't change anything. Make it work. You got a deadline. So he took the only way out he knew. And that was to sabotage the project for the test which came up in March 42. So he just detuned the equipment so when the switches were thrown, nothing worked. I mean, the transmitters lit, the tubes came alive, and power was consumed, but nothing worked. No field effects, no invisibility. So he says, well, gentlemen, I guess I goofed. It's time to leave. You have a very good man here who can take over the project. Dr. Van Neumann, I'm leaving. Bye. It's debatable whether he left or was fired, or whether they said, you were fired, and he said, you can't fire me, I quit. In any case, he left. And that was the end of Tesla insofar as that project was concerned.
What year was that?
That was 1942, March. Van Neumann took over and he looked at everything. He said to the Navy, he says, I've got to make a study of this. It obviously failed. He says, I don't know what's wrong, but I'll find out. He says, I need time. The Navy couldn't say anything. He said, give him the time. So he went ahead. We were working with him at that time. We were back and forth between the Philadelphia Navy Yard office and, of course, the Institute. I don't know where we spent more time, probably at the Institute. So Van Neumann made his own study of it and decided to change things around, and they still had the two generators that he proposed to use. In the meantime, he didn't have the battleship. It was a ship of the line that went back in service. It did not have a special crew. It had the regular crew. And they finally decided, he, of course, talking through us to the Navy brass, and we needed a special ship. It would be outfitted from the ground up. So it was decided to pick one that was going to come down the ways, and they decided on DE-173, which later was named the Eldridge. And about July of 42, they were laying the keel, and it was designed, the design was modified so they could put in two huge generators. And the reason why they had to design the equipment to the ship was the fact that the destroyer escort is not a very large ship. It's about 1,500 tons, roughly equipped. The later figure said 1,900. Dry weight was agreement between both the Greek records and the American records of 1,240 tons dry. It's a rather small destroyer. It only had two gun turrets. So to fit two huge generators and the motor drive system and all the RF equipment and the four transmitters on this thing, it took a lot of design effort, actually, from the beginning to know where you're going to fit the stuff. You don't throw it on this ship in midstream after it's built. So October it came down the ways and they wanted to dry dock, put equipment on board, and before they did this, they decided they needed a special test crew. Selected about 33 people, all volunteers, trained them up at Groveland, Connecticut from about September to December of 42, and they graduated, and the picture still exists at the graduation class. And who was the head of the class but our father? This picture there with the naval uniform and the cap and scrambled eggs and the whole bit. Still don't know how he got involved in this, but he could have transferred between the Navy and the Coast Guard because there is a letter of citation still in the records, which Duncan has had, I believe, I don't know if you think he still has it, I've seen it, a letter of citation from the Coast Guard for assistance during the wartime period, meritorious assistance during the war for the Coast Guard, et cetera, et cetera. And this was the Coast Guard Academy at Groveland where this crew was trained. So they came back to Philadelphia. And the work continued. The equipment was outfitted. And they started after the ship was not seaworthy, but actually out of dry dock, sitting at the dockside in the Philadelphia Naval Yard. A long series of tests began, a lot of modification equipment. Along about March of 42, Van Neumann started to shake a little and became concerned that maybe there's a personnel problem. He started to agree with it because Duncan and myself were both pounding on him, saying, there's going to be a personal problem. You can't turn the switch on. You're going to possibly kill people. Tesla said so. Well, to mention of Tesla's name, he got very upset. He would fly into a rage, eventually got over it. But he agreed, yeah, maybe there is a problem. What do we do about it? He decided to put in a third generator and modify the system, and at that point he still had time to do it. So he ordered and had installed a third generator along about May of 43, and it never worked right. It wouldn't sync with the other two. The other two generators, I might add, were driven off a single motor and a gearbox, right-angle gearbox drive with special electronics to synchronize the generators, because with a motor of about 750 horsepower and a gigantic gearbox is required, those gearboxes were sloppy. You could not mechanically synchronize the generators. They had to be an absolute electrical sync, so that was accomplished by other synchronizing means with special cabinets. And there's another man whom I know of who designed that equipment. And he's still alive, too. Anyway, the third generator never worked right. And finally, it went out of control one day and zapped one of the individuals assigned to us as a technician, a Navy man, first-class specialist. He was laid out completely unconscious in a coma. They hauled him off to the hospital. He recovered 4 months later, was never part of the project. So Van Neumann finally said, all right, that thing's no good, pull it out, back to the original design. On this went, finally had their sea trial for the ship about mid-June. July 1, they decided to go into the final series of tests and preparation. So about July 20th of 43, they decided, well, I guess it's ready, and make our tests. So they decided 22 July, got the whole crew together, selected about 12 individuals plus the two of us who were in the control room to operate all the equipment. There's another man who was a radio operator who is, I believe, still alive today. I've not been able to talk with him. So the fateful hour came. They ran the ship out into the harbor, stopped the engines. They did not drop anchor because they had to be floating free as it would be normally in service, and they could not ground the ship with the anchors. So it came to a stop. The orders came via radio, fire up and go through the procedures, in which we did. The ship became invisible optically as well as radar. And this lasted about 15, 20 minutes. They finally said, okay, shut it off. Bring the ship back to dock, to the dockside berth, which was done by the crew. They boarded it to expect it, and they found out there were problems. There were a lot of people on that ship who were thoroughly disoriented, sick, nauseous, and otherwise not with it. No one was dead, no one was injured as such physically, but the mind effects were severe, both physiological and psychological. Navy said, okay, pull the crew off. What's wrong? Back to Dr. Van Neumann. He says, I don't know, got to find out. So he started looking into this, and he finally decided he needed more time to study it. He said to the Navy, he says, this is going to take more time to look at. And he says, you have a drop-dead deadline of the 12th of August, 1943, to get this experiment completed, otherwise forget it. And he says, that isn't enough time. He says, that's your deadline. Well, we heard that. Duncan, or particularly I went to we went up the line. We went to Hal Bowen and said, what's this all about? He says, that's the orders I was given. He said, where did they come from? He says, I don't know, but I'll find out. We went all the way up to the CNO, which didn't make sense because the Chief of Naval Operations normally doesn't concern himself with that kind of detail in the research program. He's concerned with the operation of the war. But of course, at the same time, there was the other project called the Atomic Bomb Project, Manhattan Project, as it was known then, which was vying with this as the secret weapon for the war. So as things went on, there were night and day operations to get this equipment in order. Van Neumann made changes because the Navy finally decided they don't want optical invisibility, they don't want radar invisibility only. At that time, we didn't have inertial guidance systems. We didn't have lower end shore and worldwide.